is to protect all children. Kia ora. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
To talk about the SOP in my name, which is a regulation-making power for minimum pricing and off-licences. I have written to all members of the House and asked them to support this amendment because this amendment doesn't actually introduce minimum pricing. It simply creates the power for the government to introduce a regulation for minimum pricing when it has reached the position that it says it wishes to adopt post the work that it's doing in this area. The reason that I want to bring this into effect now by way of a regulation-making power is to ensure that the process for delivering a minimum price, should the decision be made, is actually available at the time that the decision is made, rather than to have to come back to Parliament and ask Parliament to then vote on a change to legislation that we've just passed in order to implement a minimum pricing regime. There is no way that the government will be able to, under the existing bill, introduce a minimum price without a regulation-making power within the Act to do so. What this regulation doesn't do is that it does not state a minimum price. That minimum price must be evidence-based, and that's why I've chosen a regulation-making process, because that would enable proper consultation over the establishment of the correct level to be undertaken. Some people have taken an unscripted reference in a parliamentary debate last year to $2 per standard drink, which is a statement that I did use in a speech, as a position that I have adopted. But I really want to, as I have done with the Minister personally, although I know that she has continued to repeat it, and I have said it to her personally, and I'll repeat it to the House, I do not want to implement a $2 minimum price for alcohol. The Labour Party does not have a position on this at all. It is a conscience vote on this side of the House. There is no position that Labour has adopted, and I personally haven't adopted a position of $2 per standard drink. I want to explain what I said in the House, and as I say, it was unscripted. For some time, we have not been allowed to use speeches that we've pre-written to come down to the House. We're not allowed to read out speeches. I made a reference to an amount per standard drink. I should have said it was an example of a minimum price. It certainly isn't the position that I have adopted. It was based on my mistaken view that there are 6 standard drinks in a bottle of wine. That's my mistake. Apparently there are 7.2 standard drinks in a bottle of wine. At the $6 bottle of wine, which I was seeking to target, because people can buy $6 bottles of wine, that is well under $1 per standard drink. I said that that bottle of wine should be around double that price. So that's where the $2 per standard drink came from. It was based on my mistaken view that there were 6 standard drinks in a bottle of wine, which I thought should be sold for $12, not for $6. And the reason that I said that they shouldn't be sold for $6 is that people were essentially doing a cost-benefit analysis when purchasing alcohol, although I described it with young people as a cost-trash analysis. How little can I pay for the amount of alcohol that it requires to get me trashed? Because we're talking about people who will determine whether they've had a good night out by how little they can remember of it, not by the good time that they actually had. So I want to make it absolutely clear that I do not believe that politicians should set the price based on what they think. As I have proved, what they think may in fact be mistaken. It should be done by regulation, a proper regulation-making process, and that is all the supplementary order paper proposes. And I do ask the House to consider it seriously. It means a lot, I think, to the people who've been advocating for substantive change to the law. It doesn't bind anyone to any particular position. It just facilitates change in the law once the research comes in and backs that change, which I believe that it will. Mr Chairman.
Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
Mr Chairman, the Law Commission had a section on pricing and recommended that work be undertaken, which the government is doing, and I acknowledge that. They referred to the recently released draft guidance from the UK Government's expert advisory body on medical treatment, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and this is a quote from that report. Making alcohol less affordable appears to be the most effective way of reducing alcohol-related harm. There is sufficient evidence within the published literature and from the economic analysis to justify the introduction of a minimum price per unit. The evidence suggests that young people who drink and people who drink harmful amounts of alcohol tend to choose cheaper drinks. Establishing a minimum price per unit would limit the ability of these groups to trade down to cheaper products. Mr Chairman, they also discussed excise tax over minimum pricing and had this to say. However, the difficulty with using excise tax to establish an implicit minimum price is that all alcohol products go up in price, including premium products. There is also the risk that given the purchasing power of the supermarkets and the highly competitive market, retailers will not pass on the excise tax in full or will pass it on for some beverages but not others, depending on the profit margins associated with different products. This has been my argument all the way along around minimum pricing. This is not about increasing the overall price of alcohol. This is just increasing the price of the dirt cheap alcohol, the extremely cheap alcohol, the alcohol that is cheaper than buying a bottle of Coca-Cola or buying a bottle of milk. But in the end, in the UK, or the Law Commission, they felt that more research should be done, and they recommended an immediate increase in the excise tax of 50%. I haven't actually supported that as a position because I know that not only does that example used in the UK report identify, I know that supermarkets require suppliers to absorb much of the increases themselves, so it never impacts on the price that they retail for, and it does flow on to the high end as well. High-priced wine and spirits are not the problem, it's the dirt cheap alcohol that is, and minimum pricing has no real impact on moderate drinking. After all, if you're only drinking a bottle of wine a week, then an extra $6 isn't going to make any difference if you were buying the $6 bottle, but if you were already paying more than $12 for a bottle of wine, you wouldn't be paying a cent more. So it doesn't impact on the people that we say would be affected by it. The only reason that the Ministry of Justice has given the Minister why they oppose the SOP is that they are investigating minimum pricing. The SOP relieves the Government of the need to return to the House for an amendment to the Act when the work produces a result which I believe will support minimum pricing. In my letter to MPs in the House, I referred to a comment made by the UK Prime Minister David Cameron. He said that they needed to get to grips with the problem of super cheap alcohol that's fueling violence on our streets and causing mayhem in our accident and emergency units. He believed that minimum unit pricing is a big part of the answer, and he ends his comments by saying, "This shows a radical government not frightened of taking big decisions, rolling up its sleeves and getting on with the job." I never thought for a minute that I would be quoting positively a Tory Prime Minister in this Parliament here in New Zealand, but he is right. This is time for the government to roll up its sleeves and get on with the job without coming back to Parliament to amend the Act. And that's what my SOP will do. I do want to end by commenting on the Minister's concerns around what's happened in Scotland. And yes, it is true that the Scottish Government has been forced into a situation where they've had to push back the introduction of minimum pricing as the interests find themselves swirling around this topic, as has occurred with the tobacco lobby. Essentially, the Scotch Whisky Association is, Mr. Chairman.
Fifth call.
Mr. Chairman, is essentially arguing that the commercial interests of its members should take precedence over the health and well-being of the people of Scotland. Essentially, they've had to argue that they had to decide if our society is prepared to limit commercial activity to better protect our health and quality of life, or alternatively allow powerful corporate interests to dictate health policy. And I think that's what we need to take into account here, that yes, there are powerful interests that want to stop the imposition of a minimum price, but the argument that they are producing on the other side is that this is a matter of competition, that competition should actually allow pricing to go down to its lowest level for the benefit of the consumer. Well, it may well be for the benefit of the individual consumer that they can buy an individual bottle of wine for $6, but it is not to the benefit of our country that cheap, dirt cheap alcohol is fueling violence and mayhem, and it's destroying people's abilities to make confident decisions about things that they're going to do with their lives. We have unplanned pregnancies in this country that are the result of people doing what they wouldn't otherwise do other than under the influence of alcohol. We have people making poor decisions or not being capable of making good decisions under the influence of too much alcohol. When the alcohol is so cheap that it's cheaper than a bottle of milk, then you have to understand that it's going to have an impact on the wider society. Are we here in this House seriously going to leave our law unable to respond to a report which may produce a result that says that we must act? And if that report that the government has asked for produces a result that says we must act, do we then have to come back to Parliament and amend the Act to make a power, to give us the power to do the thing that we know is the right thing to do? And I think we must continue to see the question of who is trying to influence the result on this vote. And let me just quote from the Scottish situation again, the Chief Executive of Alcohol Focus Scotland, who stated, having failed to use their formidable lobbying power to prevent the passage of the minimum pricing law in Scotland, the global corporations now seek to get the legislation struck down by the courts. In taking this action, they follow the well-trodden path of the tobacco industry and other transnational corporations who use their considerable financial clout to oppose public health policies that threaten their shareholders' profits. Make no mistake about it. That is what this issue is all about. And that is why this is the issue that I have chosen for the SOP that I wanted to bring to this House and to have this debate, because it is an issue that was raised in the Alcohol in Our Lives Curbing the Harm report that the Law Commission wrote after listening to the people of New Zealand. It is an issue which is subject to misinformation. It is subject to an outrageous level of lobbying and attack from a very well-resourced industry. And the poor old publicly funded public health institutions are left struggling to compete with the level of pressure that those multinational corporations can bring to bear. We were in this House debating this issue on tobacco many, many years ago, and I know that nobody would want to own being on the wrong side of that. I don't want anyone to own being on the wrong side of this issue. It is simply a regulation-making power which, when the evidence is produced, enables the government to take immediate action and to have a proper consultation process about what that minimum price should be. I don't think anyone in this House would agree that $6 for a bottle of wine, enabling people to do that cost trash analysis before they go out and expose themselves to an unsafe environment, would stand for that.
Kevin Haig.
Thank you very much.